Okay, let's go to the China side of this. The big concern here is that the brewing cold or, God forbid, hot war between the United States and China in the 21st century. How do we avoid that?
So a few things. One is, I do think the best way we also avoid it is by reducing the consequences to the United States in the event of that type of conflict. Because at that point, what you're setting up for, if the consequences are existential for the United States, then what you're buying yourself in the context of what could be a small conflict is an all-out great war. So the first thing I want to make sure we avoid is a major conflict between the United States and China, like a World War level conflict. And the way to do that is to bring down the existential stakes for the U.S. And the way we bring down the existential stakes for the U.S. is make sure that the United States does not depend on China for our modern way of life. Right now we do. Okay, so right now we depend on China for everything from the pharmaceuticals in our medicine cabinet. 95% of ibuprofen, one of the most basic medicines used in the United States, depends on China for its supply chain. We depend on China, ironically, for our own military industrial base. Think about how little sense that makes, actually. Our own military, which supposedly exists to protect ourselves against adversaries, depends for its own supplies, semiconductors and otherwise, on our top adversary. That doesn't make sense. Even if you're a libertarian in the school of Friedrich von Hayek, somebody I admire as well, even then you would not argue for a foreign dependence on adversary for your military. So I think that's the next step we need to take, is at least reduce U.S. dependence on China for the most essential inputs for the functioning of the United States of America, including our own military. As a side note, I believe that means not just onshoring to the United States. It does. But if we're really serious about that, it also means expanding our relationships with allies like Japan, South Korea, India, the Philippines. And that's an interesting debate to have, because some on the right would say, okay, I want to decouple from China, but I also want less trade with all these other places. You can't have both those things at the same time. You can have one or the other. You can't have both. And so we have to acknowledge and be honest with ourselves that there are trade-offs to declaring independence from China. But the question is, what are the long-run benefits? Now, you think about the other way to do this is strategic clarity. I think the way that you see world wars often emerge is strategic ambiguity from two adversaries who don't really know what the other side's red line is or isn't, and accidentally crosses those red lines. And so I think we need to be much clearer with what are our hard red lines and what aren't they. And I think that's the single most effective way to make sure this doesn't spiral into major world war. And then let's talk about ending the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the terms that I just discussed with you before. I think weakening the Russia-China alliance not only reduces the risk that Russia becomes an aggressor, it also reduces the risk that China takes the risks that could escalate us to World War III as well. So I think that geopolitically, you got to look at these things holistically. That end of the Russia-Ukraine war and that peace deal de-escalates not only the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but the risk of a broader conflict that includes China as well, by also weakening China, because Russia also has hypersonic missiles and missile capabilities that are ahead of that of China's. If Russia is no longer in a military alliance with China, that changes China's calculus as well. So that's kind of, I think, more strategic vision we need in our foreign policy than we've had since certainly, the Nixon era. I think that you need people who are going to be able to challenge the status quo, question the existing orthodoxies, the willingness to use levers to get great deals done that otherwise wouldn't have gotten done. And that's why I do think someone like Donald Trump in the presidency, and obviously I ran for president as an outsider and a businessman as well. I think this is an area, our foreign policy is one where we actually benefit from having business leaders in those roles rather than people who are shackled by the traditional political manner of thinking.
I think the thing you didn't quite make clear, but I think implied, is that we have to accept the red line that China provides of the one China policy.
Both sides need to have their red lines. So, we can get into specifics, but it's gonna vary depending on the circumstances. But the principle that I would give you is that we have to have a hard red line that's clear. I think that hard red line, I was clear during my campaign on this, so I'll say it again, is I think that we have to have a clear red line that China will not and should not, for any time in the foreseeable future, annex Taiwan. I do think that for the United States, it probably is prudent right now not to suddenly upend the diplomatic policy we've adopted for decades of what is recognizing the one China policy and our position of quiet deference to that. And understand that may be their red line, is the national recognition of Taiwan as an independent nation would be a red line that China would have, but we would have a red line to say that we do not, in any circumstance, tolerate the annexation by physical force in any time in the foreseeable future when that's against the interests of the United States of America. So those are examples. But the principle here is, you asked, how do we avoid major conflict with China? I think it starts with clear red lines on both sides. I think it starts with also lowering the stakes for the United States by making sure we're not dependent on China for our modern way of life. And I think it also starts with, ironically, using a peaceful resolution to the Ukraine war as a way of weakening the Russia-China alliance, which in the other direction of weakening China has significant benefits to us as well.
But what do you do when China says very politely, we're going to annex Taiwan, whether you like it or not?
Against the backdrop that I just laid out, that's not going to happen. That wouldn't happen if we actually make sure that we're crystal clear about what our red lines and priorities are. We're also dependent on Taiwan right now for our own semiconductor supply chain. So China knows that's going to draw us into serious conflict in that circumstance. So against the backdrop of clearly drawn red lines, against the backdrop of Russia no longer automatically being in China's camp, that's a big lever. I think also strengthening our relationship with other allies where we have room to strengthen those relationships, like India. And I'm not just saying that, because my name is Vivek Ramaswamy, right? I'm saying it because it's strategically important to the United States to understand that, God forbid, in a conflict scenario, China would perceive some risk to the Indian Ocean or the Andaman Sea, no longer being reliable for getting Middle Eastern oil supplies. There's a lot of levers here, but I think that if we are both strategically clear with our allies and with our adversaries about what our red lines are, what our priorities are, reasonable deals that pull Russia out of the hands of China and vice versa, reasonable allies and relationships that cause China to question whether it can continue to have the same access to Middle Eastern oil supplies as it does today, and then clear red lines with China itself about what we definitely aren't okay with, and understand that they may have certain red lines too. That allows us, I think, to still avoid what many people will call the unavoidable conflict, the Thucydides trap, against the circumstance of when there's a rising power against the backdrop of a declining power, conflict always becomes inevitable. That's a theory. It's not a law of physics. And I don't think that, A, we have to be a declining power, and B, I don't think that has to necessarily result in major conflict with China here. It's going to require real leadership with a spine. And you don't have to judge based on international relations theory to form your view on this. 4 years under Trump, we didn't have major conflicts in the Middle East, in places like Russia, Ukraine. We were on the cusp of war with North Korea when Obama left office and Trump took over. 4 years under Biden, less than 4 years under Biden and Harris, what do you have? Major conflicts in the Middle East, major conflict in Russia, Ukraine, judged by the results. And, I would say that even if you're somebody who disagrees with a lot of Donald Trump and you don't like his style, if your single issue is you want to stay out of World War III, I think there's a pretty clear case for why you go for Trump in this election.